Cuba is now off limits to cruise ships as the United States imposes new restrictions on recreation and educational trips. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. The new travel restrictions imposed by the United States pose another setback for Cuba's fragile economy. The U.S. Treasury Department announced the U.S. will no longer allow educational trips known as people-to-people exchanges and is banning private air travel and cruise ships. The Cruise Line International Association says the move immediately impacts 800,000 bookings. CGTN's Chirino begins our coverage with this report from Havana.
The new travel restrictions, which prohibit U.S. cruise ships from calling at Cuban harbors, went into force on Wednesday, June the 5th. However, a provision will allow Americans who booked a group tour to Cuba prior to that date to visit. U.S. cruise companies like Carnival Cruise Line promptly announced they were canceling scheduled trips to the Caribbean island. The Cuban government reacted with an official statement published in the Communist Party newspaper Granma, saying that Cuba will not be intimidated by the U.S. blockade and blasted attempts to force political concessions by hurting the country's economy and living conditions for its people. This cruise ship behind me may be one of the last of its kind to come from Florida to Havana Harbor, following the latest restrictions by the U.S. administration, which directly affect the private sector that offers services to the American passengers on board these vessels.
Nosotros vivimos de ese turismo.
We earn our living from this kind of tourism. If they stop coming, how can we make a living? We'll have nothing, so we'll see a strong impact. This U.S. policy will not affect the government. It'll affect us, the people.
Jose Antonio Perez opened his private restaurant in Old Havana some 24 years ago, and he regrets the tightening of restrictions on U.S. travelers to Cuba.
During the short time they are here, these visitors are learning about private businesses, meeting people, tasting Cuban food. Now we will be forced to go back to the times when we had no cruise ships arriving and try to cushion the impact that this will have on us.
Also affected by the new measures, those who offer city tours to visitors in vintage cars or in horse carriages. Fewer tourists means fewer passengers. For Cuban tourist specialist Jose Perello, the cruise ships provide an important source of livelihood to private workers.
All these cruise ship tourists come to see the new Cuba. They are major consumers of private services. They buy crafts, they eat at private restaurants, and interact with the locals. So the U.S. argument about closing the doors to the Cuban government with these sanctions is not as they say, because they are actually affecting a sector that does not have any strong links to the Cuban government.
For many people here, the U.S. travel sanctions are a lose-lose proposition. Not only will more Americans not be able to visit Cuba, those on the island who count on tourists will miss out on the economic benefits. Chirino, CGTN, Havana.